Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. I want to welcome everybody to My Horse University's web presentation series, and tonight we're featuring Matt Shane. Matt Shane is the County Extension Director for Michigan State University in Lenawee County. He is also the multi-county livestock educator for several southeast Michigan counties. Shane graduated from Michigan State University in 1994 with a bachelor's degree in animal science and with a master's of science degree in animal science in 1998. As a livestock educator, Shane works primarily with horse, beef, sheep producers. His primary subject areas are hay and pastures, manure management issues, and facilities. Many of the livestock owners in southeast Michigan desire a forage management system involving little or no chemical inputs. Shane has worked with many producers to develop sustainable forage management strategies. So let's go ahead and welcome Matt Shane tonight, and he will be presenting on hay selection. And I'm going to switch it over to Matt. We're also going to be, he will be taking questions during the presentation, just as a note, but just limit your questions to the slides that are being shown. We will also take questions at the end for about 15 minutes. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy.
Well, welcome everybody. Hope that you're all hearing me okay here. It's the first time that I've done one of these web presentations, and I'm sort of looking forward to it. So, as Kate said, if you have questions, feel free to let me know those, and I'll take the ones that I can as we go, and the rest of them we'll try and get covered at the end. Tonight's presentation is mainly focusing on hay management, and the direction that I decided to take with this was for purchasing hay off the farm. We could spend a whole presentation on producing hay, but decided that most of the horse owners that I work with on a regular basis are people that are buying hay from off farm and bringing it to their farm. So some of the things that we're going to look at this evening are when purchasing hay, where should you buy it, when's the best time to buy, how do you know what the quality looks like, how do you set a price, looking at different availability options, storage capacities, and what are some of the best ways to store hay. We're also going to cover how much hay would you need, what kind of capacity do you have to have depending on the number of horses, how do you collect a hay sample to do a nutrient analysis to make sure that your horses are getting what they need, handling bales of different sizes and types, some different feeding methods for ways to feed hay to horses, and there is a debate over among a lot of areas in the horse industry on how we should be feeding hay to horses, and we'll talk about some of those. And also talk about wasted feed and what the cost and ways that we can manage that a little bit. And a problem that we have here in Michigan particularly is a not new weed, but it's a weed that's showing up a lot more these days called Horiolisum, and we'll spend just a few minutes talking about that. A couple things I wanted to cover on hay production, just as hay buyers, some things that you need to understand just starting off about purchasing hay and the process of making hay that makes it difficult sometimes to get hay that producers are looking for. And one of the things that you need to know is that hay is a very weather dependent crop, and Murphy's Law applies to hay production too. It's usually too dry when the hay should be growing, and it's too wet when it should be baled. And so that's one of the things that hay producers have to face is high humidity, drying days, weather versus maturity. There's some issue over when do you harvest that first cutting of hay to make the subsequent cuttings come into play and be of their optimum quality, and so you have to throw that into consideration as well. In some cases we don't want the best quality hay, we want optimum volume at the best nutrient content that we can get. When those two graphs cross, then we're happy with that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Typically we would expect 2 to 3 cuttings a year in lower Michigan, and that happens usually about 40 to 60 days apart, starting sometime in mid-May or early June, and ending up sometime typically in September. And when we harvest this hay, it's going to take 2 to 4 days to dry it, and so that is going to be dependent on the heat, wind, as well as the humidity. And humidity tends to be a problem for us, especially midsummer, and getting those later cuttings dried. In terms of insects, producers that are raising hay should be scouting fields on a regular basis and looking for insect damage, because insect damage not only reduces yield, but it also greatly can affect hay quality, especially in the earlier cuttings. If you get a lot of leaf loss from insect damage, that can greatly affect protein quantities and those types of things, so you have to be aware of that. Typically in first cutting, we see alfalfa weevils being the primary pest of problem, and that is a problem if there's alfalfa and other legumes in the plants. Potato leafhoppers are a problem after first cutting, and again, these are primarily insects that affect alfalfa, but a lot of our hays that are fed to horses contain at least some alfalfa, and that's where a large portion of our protein comes from in feeding this hay. So now getting into how much hay do you need for your horses, and there's some behavioral things that come into play with that. First of all, horses that are, if they were just left to themselves and they had all the forage available that they wanted to eat and they could go out and graze, which is what they would like to do, have their head down between their feet 18 to 22 hours a day chewing. And so that's something that you need to think about in terms of the way that we feed hay to horses. When we change the way that we're delivering that hay and we're feeding them maybe 2 big meals a day, and not allowing them to eat over a longer period of time, that does affect digestibility, and it diminishes the availability of the quality of the material that we feed. So we can reduce the quality a little bit and offer more feed to those animals over a longer period of time, which will actually increase digestibility of that material. So in looking at how much hay is a horse going to eat over that 24-hour period, typically they're going to consume about 2 to 3% of their body weight a day in dry matter. So in terms of sourcing hay, I always use the 2.5 to 3% range, so that we're sure that we're going to have enough hay. It's better to have a few bales left over the next growing season than to run out when the weather's still bad and there's not hay available. Typically, if you have a grazing season, if you have pasture available, in our area, we look at about a 160-day growing season, which starts sometime in early May and it goes until usually about mid-October. So if we take a look at an example of how much hay we're going to go through, we make some assumptions. Of course, we have a 1,000-pound horse on average, assuming that there's a forage-only diet. If you're feeding grains or some other type of a supplement, you have to factor that into the nutrient content that that animal is going to be consuming a day, and so you want to make sure that you account for that. But assuming that we're feeding those animals on a forage-only diet, and the animal is housed 12 hours a day during the grazing season, which would typically be a daylight hours, turn out in the evening, or vice versa. Some do it the other way, but assuming that they're stalled half the time and out half the time, that's approximately a 160-day turnout period. And during that grazing season, we'll also assume that 25% of the daily intake will be fed in the stall. That would be hay that would be fed either morning and or in the evening, making up about a quarter of what that animal would consume in a day. And again, this assumes that when they're outside that they have pasture available to them. If they don't, then hay should probably be fed outdoors as well. And then the remainder of the year, the other 205 days that we have left in our year, when those animals are going to be not grazing because we're outside of our growing season, they're would be consuming a free choice hay diet, which means they're going to be eating that 2 to 3% of their body weight a day in hay. They have that available to them all the time. And we'll also make the assumption that the hay is put up at about 85% dry matter. This is fairly average, around 15% moisture in that hay as it sits in a barn is pretty typical of what we would see if we tested hay year-round. So putting those numbers into some calculations, and here's we get into a little bit of math, but we'll work through these bullet points one at a time. If you take a look at the calculations here, 1,000-pound horse eating 2.5% of its body weight a day in dry matter, that's 25 pounds per day of dry matter that would be consumed. Factoring the 85% dry matter into that equation, we come up with 28.75 pounds of hay a day. Now again, during that 160-day period, looking at the next bullet point here, taking 25% of their daily intake in hay during that time frame times the 28.75 pounds of as-fed hay a day times the 160 days gives us about 1,150 pounds of hay consumed during that 160-day growing season. So then the next factor that we have to take into place is the 205 days when they're going to be eating harvested forage exclusively. And so taking the 28.75 times the 205 days, we come up with just under 6,000 pounds of hay consumed during those winter months. Add those two numbers together, we're just a little bit over 7,000 pounds of hay per horse per year. That's about 3.5 tons. Assuming a 50-pound bale of hay, which is pretty average, that would be 140 bales per year. So now if your hay bales weigh differently than that, then you would obviously change that calculation. But the bottom line is we're feeding, in this scenario anyway, we're feeding about 3.5 tons of hay per horse per year. So now taking that into consideration, looking at storage capacity, assume that the average small square bale of hay is going to be, that 50-pound bale is going to be about 5.25 cubic feet. So if we had an area that's 10 by 10 by 10, that would hold enough hay, or 190 bales. So if the average horse is going to consume about 140 bales using our example, we have capacity for 190 in a 10 by 10 by 10 area. So that gives you some idea of storage capacity if you have more horses and a longer feeding period, how much hay room you might just need to store that hay. Now if you're feeding round bales, a 4 by 5 foot round bale weighing 600 to 800 pounds is going to take up about 100 cubic feet. And obviously if you're using round bales for hay, there's storage issues and other things that come into play, but also some additional handling equipment is going to be required for those larger bales. You can't pick them up and move them around like you can with the 50-pound small square bale. So then taking a look at if we're buying hay, I always recommend to producers that they try and purchase hay by the ton rather than paying by the bale. Now some hay sellers are comfortable with by the ton and have access to scales and things like that, others cannot. But one of the things that I always recommend is that as a producer that you at least take the time to weigh a few bales and try and get an average weight of the bale, even if you are purchasing by the bale. And if you look at the example that I have here, with the difference between a 30-pound bale and a 50-pound bale at approximately the same price, $2.03 versus $2 a bale, the difference is $135 a ton versus $80 a ton. Now remember, that horse is going to eat 3.5 tons of hay a year in the scenario that we had, and they don't care whether it's a 30-pound or a 50-pound bale. So at that same price, as a horse owner, you need to be aware of roughly how many tons of hay that you're buying. So you can do that simply by weighing a few average bales. Even if you bring your bathroom scale with you, pick up a bale and stand on it and see what the difference in weight is to come up with a rough estimate so that you know if are you getting the value for your money or not. Typically you can find an advertised price for hay in your area on a ton basis, and you can compare that to what you're paying by the bale or by the ton with the hay that you're purchasing. You also want to make sure that you examine several bales of hay prior to purchase, and this is true regardless of whether you're buying your hay at an auction market or directly off of a farm, or maybe even right out of the field. And so one of the things that we have to look at is making sure that you analyze several bales, because if you get a lot of light bales initially in a load and then heavy ones, or the quality can vary greatly throughout a load, so you want to examine that hay. And I've gotten a couple of questions here on hay prices, and yes, this year the $2 a bale, people are dreaming for that in our area and around the country. Hay prices have really gone up, and there's a lot of factors involved in that. Dry weather has a lot to do with it. The $2 is just an example, but there is a wide variety in prices right now in hay. I still see some hay advertised in our area in the $2.50 to $4 range, but some of that probably isn't the better quality hay. But I have heard for hay going up $9, $10 a bale, and certainly in some of the southern states it's up a whole lot higher than that. And you can see some of the prices up here, $13, $16 a bale. We're going to talk a little bit about hay quality as we go through here a little bit further in terms of selecting some hay. So we'll get back to purchasing here and looking at buying hay as a horse owner, it's important to not necessarily go to a hay seller and say, I'm looking for horse hay. Most of you know that own horses, one of the things that you find that if you put the word horse in front of it, there tends to be a higher price associated with that than if you're talking about something else. And in terms of hay, hay is hay. You need good quality hay for your horses, but there really is no such thing as horse hay. You just need high quality hay, and the quality is going to depend on the type of horses that you have. Generally, horses at maintenance that don't get a lot of heavy workouts during a week are just a good quality grass hay, which can be sometimes difficult to find depending on where you live, may be difficult. So you're just looking for a good quality hay, and we'll talk about determining quality a little bit more in just a little bit. The other thing, if you can do it, if it works out and you have the availability in your area to find all the hay from one source, that's typically a good way to go. Because if you can source it from one owner or one farm or one area, then you pretty much can determine what your quality is going to be when the hay is harvested is going to be at the same time. You can work with that. So trying to find from one source is always a good idea. Also makes a difference in determining quality. If you're really trying to get at what's the nutrient value of the hay that you have, you don't have to run a lot of different hay samples. If you're buying from one source, you could just sample each cutting, for example, instead of having to sample numerous sources if you're getting hay from a lot of different places. One of the things in trying to keep costs down and looking at buying hay is if you can get the hay during the growing season when that hay is being harvested. You certainly have storage issues with that. If you don't have the capacity to store that hay, again, looking at the volumes that we talked about earlier, it is important to keep in mind that you want to try and figure out what you're going to use, especially if you have a winter where you are where there isn't going to be hay available. Trying to buy it during the growing season is certainly one way to keep the cost down. And one way that some producers work through that is if they don't have the storage themselves, is you could pay a nominal fee to a lot of hay sellers that do have storage capacity for hay. Many of them will store it for a small fee, and that fee tends to be less than what you would have to pay if you were trying to buy hay that hadn't been purchased previously. But if you can lock in your price early, maybe pay in advance and then pay a storage fee on that hay in somebody else's barn and pick it up as you need it, that's certainly one way that you can keep costs down there if you can find producers that make that option available to you. Typically, after we hit the first of the year, those hay producers that have been holding on to hay stores start to flood the market with that hay. And so initially the hay prices really go up, then they drop for a little bit as the market gets flooded, but then usually right around the first of the year is when we start to see those prices start to jump up because the supply starts to go down. And so the hay supply gets tighter. Obviously, supply and demand would indicate that our price would begin to increase. And so trying to get your hay in before that period of time is always a good way to do it if you can. One of the things that you may do as a horse owner would be to consider purchasing some old crop hay for summer feeding, because the hay quality, if you have pasture available to you and you're just feeding during some stalling times, you certainly don't need as high a quality of feed as you would during the winter months. And so buying some of that old crop or last year's hay, which would tend to be have a decreased vitamin content, certainly would still have some protein and energy values, and so you can use that hay to get you through the growing season and often pick that up at a less expensive price as long as you can and put that hay in and get it used up before you go into the next winter months. One of the questions that came up here is about the storage of fresh hay, and that we'll get to the feeding of fresh hay too. One of the things, if you're buying hay right out of the field, hay goes through a fermentation and curing process, and so once that hay is put in a stack, it needs to stay there for at least 2 weeks. 3 to 4 weeks would be better. A lot of times if hay supplies are tight and you can't get it that fast. Well, I got some calls this summer from producers that were concerned that were hauling hay down south, that some of the hay was moldy when it got there, and that is because when you have an oxygen-free environment when that hay is a stack and you start moving that stack around, you're putting oxygen where there wasn't previously oxygen available, and it disrupts the fermentation process, and you can actually get mold to develop in hays that wouldn't have normally molded if they were allowed to cure. So that hay needs to sit for at least 2 weeks before you start feeding it and or moving it around. So once it's gone into a stack, it should sit for a while, and if you do that, then once it's cured, then you can move it around freely and stack it and move it, and you're not going to have the risk of mold developing and those other types of issues that you worry about with handling fresh hay. So how do we determine quality on hay? There's some visual factors that we can work through, but the only true way that you can determine what's the value of that hay to your horse nutritionally is to have a forage test done. Forage tests are relatively inexpensive when you take into account the cost of your hay, and if you can determine that the hay is a little better quality than what you thought, and you can buy some lesser quality hay to blend with it that might be a little bit less expensive, those are some ways that you can keep costs down, but you don't know that unless you've actually done a forage test. And I recommend that hay is tested for each cutting, because there's going to be obviously a nutrient difference between cuttings, and so you'd want to test that, and if you're getting it from multiple sources, then each batch of that hay should be tested as well. And that's what makes it difficult if you're looking at buying hay from several different farms in the area, or it's being trucked in from different places, and you're buying lot loads at an auction. You're probably not going to be able to turn around forage tests quickly enough to have them be of much value to you. So again, trying to source large lots at one time gives you the advantage of being able to use that information for nutrient testing. Here's some pictures of what the hay testing equipment looks like that is available. There's a lot of different types and styles. I just picked a couple here for this presentation. This Penn State forage sampler attaches to it a handheld or an electric drill, and it takes a core sample of the bale. Most labs that do forage testing prefer core samples because you get a more representative sample of different bales versus grabbing a handful of hay out of a bale. They can certainly grind that sample and get a representative sample out of that, but if you're taking a handful, it doesn't take very many handfuls to fill a bag, and so you're not representing as many bales in that sample. And typically we like to see 15 or 20 bales sampled for every couple hundred or so bales that are put in the barns, and it gives us a pretty good representation. Mix that all together and then send that sample in. There's also moisture meters available. A lot of producers that are baling hay have moisture testers available if they're not quite sure how well the hay is drying, or if it's dry enough to be baled. You can use a moisture tester for that. You may also want one as a producer. As a consumer, if you're buying hay may feel a little damp to you, you can use a moisture tester to make sure that you're getting the hay dry enough. Typically with small square baled hay, we like to see moisture at no more than about 17%. If it gets much above 17%, we have an increased risk of mold and also barn combustion issues. If that hay gets hot enough, it can heat up enough to start to smolder and start a fire. So we want to keep that hay under 17% if possible. And actually there's a myth out there that if you're brown baling hay, that round baled hay can handle a little bit more moisture and still keep, and that's actually not true. Round baled hay should be even a little bit drier to maintain its quality than what we would put small square bales in the barn, and that has to do a lot with the way that hay is stacked and stored, and how we handle it as to why that hay doesn't keep quite as well. And certainly there's hay that's been put up a lot more than 17% that has turned out okay, but you do run a risk when you get that. So trying to keep that hay somewhere between 14 and 15, 16% is really ideal in terms of putting up a good quality hay into the barn. So if we're collecting hay samples, again, cores are preferred. 10 to 20 bales should be sampled, and that'll depend on your lot size and what you have, but that gives us a pretty good representative sample. If you're not going to use the information, if you're not going to actually compare that to a nutritional plan for your animals, then maybe testing doesn't mean anything to you. If you're not going to utilize the information, don't spend the money on the test. But if you're just curious as to what protein level you're at or what energy level you're at, that's fine. But I would encourage you to use that information if you have it. And again, each cutting should be sampled, because There's some places where we're getting 4, 5, 6 cuttings, but here in Michigan we typically get no more than 3. But just because third cutting tends to be more nutrient dense doesn't mean that that's the best quality hay that is available, because the way that hay is handled, the way that it's harvested, if it gets too dry and the leaves come off, you can certainly reduce quality by the way that hay is baled. So you can't always assume that one is better than the other, that the later cutting is better than an earlier cutting. So hay sampling is the only way that you can determine that. So if you're looking at hay and trying to determine what type of hay should I be looking at, what some visual factors that I can take into account to make sure that I'm getting the best hay for my horses, typically we start with color. Color is not the only factor, but it is a very good factor that we can use to determine hay quality. Hay that's very bleached out, meaning it's more yellow in color than it is green, it was exposed to a lot more sunlight over a longer period of time, means that hay may have lost some of its nutrients during the drying process. Sometimes that can indicate that, for example, hay that's been rained on prior to baling and that has to get re-dried out again, it may not have dust, it may not have mold, it may have dried down just fine, but it bleaches out some of the color. It looks more like straw than it does hay in some cases, and that's a factor that we can use to determine quality. Now, just because hay is a little bit yellowed, maybe some of that grassier first cutting hay does tend to have a little bit more of a brownish yellow color to it. That may be just the type of hay that you need for some good winter fill type hay to blend with maybe some better hay, but color is not the only factor. The other thing to keep in mind when we look at hay quality is there's no such thing as completely dust-free or completely mold-free. You try and minimize the amount of dust and mold, and certainly mold is more of a concern, but just inherent in the baling process and driving tractors across the field, running the hay rake, some dirt is going to be stirred up because it's dry when we're typically baling this hay. There's not moisture there, and so we do stir a little bit of dust and dirt up, and that's going to get into that hay, so there's going to be some dust. But you don't want an excessive amount of dust, and that's hard to define, not having a visual aid to be able to do that with, but you just want to use common sense. If there's a little bit of dust, that's okay. If you open up the bale and dust comes pouring out, then obviously there's too much dust. Same goes for mold. There shouldn't be any noticeable mold odor. You don't want to see hay that's clumped together with white or black. That indicates a high level of mold. But to find a couple of moldy spots in a bale from time to time is pretty typical. That you get to the end of a row when you're baling hay, that material's been driven over, or maybe when you turn around with a hay rake, it gets bunched up a little bit, there's some moisture, you're going to find mold from time to time. And if you do have some level of mold, just take that hay and throw it out. Don't feed it to the horses, but there shouldn't be bales full of mold. That's basically the rule of thumb that you want to live by there. Stage of maturity is another thing visually that you can determine. You can look for alfalfa plants and see if you see any little purple flowers. That's an indication that hay is at full bloom. If you see a lot of purple flowers, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, the stemmier the hay is, the more waste that you tend to get, so stage of maturity is important. Looking at the amount of leaf. If there's a lot of stems and not a lot of leaves to go with them, if you're dealing with a legume type hay, that's an indication that quality may be decreased. Color, again, is important. Odor, you want to put your nose in those bales of hay and see what they smell like. They should smell fresh, not have a dusty or moldy odor to them. And so that's something that's important. Is the hay tough versus soft? And again, that's sort of hard to define, but if it's very stemmy and scratchy and versus a lot of soft grasses in it, that may impact the way that the horses eat it. And that depends on what your horses are used to, but there are some differences in how that hay handles and how it feels. And then how much foreign material is there? Is there a lot of sticks and leaves? Was it baled along a woodlot or something where we have a lot of deciduous leaves mixed in with that material? Maybe there's some bales that have a high amount of weeds in them. Those types of things. Or you can certainly determine quality by how much foreign material is mixed in with those bales. And again, that goes to examining several bales prior to purchase. And so, getting back at the determining price aspect of baling hay, or buying hay, get an average bale weight, even if you're purchasing hay by the bale. you want to try and get an average bale weight. Also consider the possibility of storage. Can you store it on farm, or can you hire storage or find an empty barn someplace to store some hay in so that you can lock in that price. Also consider time of year. Hay price, obviously, if there's a drought, hay price is going to be very high. And then as we get into winter, when there isn't any more hay being made, that price is going to continue to go up. So trying to purchase hay in the non-growing season months is going to be much more difficult than purchasing it during the growing season. And some things, if you're a smaller scale producer and you're buying little bits of hay, those types of things, sometimes you want to consider some of the extras in determining price. You lock in that ton price, but then there may be some other factors that come into play. There may be some extras. There may be delivery. If your hay is delivered to you on site, maybe it's even delivered and stacked in the barn. Those are some things that you want to. Producers shouldn't have to do those things for free. And so when if you feel that you get a reasonable price for the hay itself, then you might want to consider increasing that price a little bit to get some of these extra services that may come along with that. Another extra that may be involved would be guarantees. The advantage of working directly with a farm owner that's baling hay is you might have the opportunity to go back if the hay quality isn't quite what you want it to be or where you think it should be. You can then go back and say, this is not what we wanted. I've been a customer for a long time. Can we work something out that's going to make this hay fit a little bit more what I need, and exchange some bales or whatever needs to be done. And a lot of times if you have a relationship, you can do that. But those producers that work under those agreements often get a little bit of a premium for their hay because they're offering that service as part of it. So just keep those things in mind as well. Couple places that you may consider buying hay. One is at an auction yard, and again, auctions are always buyer beware, regardless of whether you're buying livestock or hay or farm equipment or anything else at an auction. It's always up to the buyer to determine what it is that they're buying. And so, we've had some instances and some hay auctions around that I've witnessed where the good quality hay is on the outside of the stack, and as we get into the middle, we get some hay that's not represented as it should be. That doesn't happen very often, fortunately, but it does happen from time to time. Most of the time, a hay that's in a stack is pretty uniform throughout, but you certainly want to look at the quality of the hay throughout that stack. Survey several bales within the stack, even if you have to move them around a little bit. That's usually acceptable. Depending on the hay market. You also want to get there early and take a look at the hay, study it. Don't run up as they're bidding and buy something that you're not sure what you're getting. So that's important. You also want to set a price limit in your head before you get there and try and stick to it. This goes for basically any auction buying, but when you're bidding against other people that want the same thing that you want, sometimes you tend to not pay as much attention to what you're doing instead of the competition, and you might end up paying more than what you wanted to. So find that price and stick with it. Just remember that in auction, hay quality is highly variable, or can be, so you need to make sure you do your homework. And the other problem with buying hay from auctions is it's hard to get a consistent supply. Sometimes you get you're going to have different producers there each week. As one runs out of supply, a new producer may show up to fill that spot, and so it's hard to get consistent quality hay, and that's modifying your horse's diet slightly if you can't keep that consistent, and so that can lead to some issues too, so you want to try and keep it as consistent as possible. If you're buying it from another farm, then you have the ability to establish a relationship. You have the possibility of that guarantee or some returns coming into place. You have the ability to negotiate. Maybe it's quantity, maybe there's some storage, there's some things that you can negotiate. The difficulty of that is it's subject to availability. When a producer runs out of hay, they run out of hay. So if you get to them too far down the list, you may not have the hay available that you need, and then you're forced to go to another place to get hay that may end up being an auction to fill some of that gap. But it is nice to have a relationship with somebody that you can work with on a consistent basis anytime that you're buying feed for livestock. So in terms of availability, as many of you know very well, weather is going to have a big impact on how much hay is available. So as a hay purchaser, you need to keep in mind what's going on with the environment just as the hay grower does, and pay attention to what's happening with the weather and during the growing season to know, is hay going to be short this year? Is there going to be plenty? And how far can I afford to wait before we're going to have a problem where I might not have enough hay to feed my horses? And it's going to vary. Quality and availability is going to vary greatly around the state and country, so depending on where you get your hay from, you need to be cognizant of that. When hay is in good supply, you may consider putting on some extra. Again, remember, you could keep some of that hay around another year and feed it as summer feed the next year if you need to. So if you have the capacity and availability to do it, you may put some other in. You never know when we're going to have a serious drought year, as we have in some parts of the country now, and there isn't going to be hay. So if you have the ability to put extra hay in the barn, even if the quality isn't there, you can always supplement with grain or some other supplements, but to be able to keep that horse's digestive system working, they need that fiber, they need that roughage. So even if it's 2-year-old, 3-year-old hay, if it's been stored properly, you just would need some extra supplementation, but you can certainly use it to meet the horse's fiber needs. So don't be afraid to put in extra hay. You just want to rotate that out as you put new in, and try not keep it around for years and years, but use it when you need it. And consider extra storage capacity. Is it feasible to put up a temporary structure or some other type of thing to have some additional storage to help keep costs down longer term? If you're in the horse business for the long term, having that storage capacity on your farm may be beneficial to you to keep those costs down. You may not realize those savings right away, but you could certainly realize them long term. Big bales, I get a lot of questions as an extension educator about feeding big bales to horses, and again, I mentioned the difficulty in harvesting that hay, that it really does need to be dry. There's certainly some handling and storage issues that you need. It's nice to be able to take those slices off of a small square bale and feed it to the horses by hand. If you're feeding round bales or big square bales, you've got some handling issues there, but it's the same hay. As long as it was handled well and appropriately, there's no reason that you can't feed that hay to horses. Individual horses is a little bit of a difficulty, but it can be done. Quality can be an issue. You have to not just assume that it was handled properly and appropriately, because as I mentioned, a lot of producers will, with the rains coming, the hay's a little damp, might get out the round balers, so you want to make sure that you assess the quality before you purchase. And really, that round baled hay needs to be stored just like square baled hay. It should be stored inside or very well covered immediately after harvest, and not sitting outside just because it's round baled hay, because we can have a lot of waste with that if it's not handled appropriately. So waste is a concern with the big bales. If you're feeding, especially if you're feeding them outside to a group of horses, for example, a 900-pound round bale is going to take 7 horses about 4 days to eat. And if hay sits out much more than 3 or 4 days, you're going to start to suffer some quality losses, unless you're in a very dry and we're not getting a lot of rain, those types of things. Weather exposure to that hay, typically you want to use that hay up certainly within a week. And if you don't have the number of horses available to do that, then round bales may not work in a group setting. You might want to consider unwrapping by hand or doing something like that into feeders and feeding it on more of a limited basis. So I like this slide. It doesn't have anything to do with horses. It has to do with sheep, but it gets to the idea of hay waste. And if you have bales that are stored outside, uncovered, as these ones obviously were here, you want to keep in mind that 30% of the hay in a 5-foot diameter bale is held in the outer 6 inches. And so clearly by this picture, there's more than 6 inches of hay in that bale, so we're wasting more than 30% of the hay, not to mention the hay that you see there scattered around on the ground, and horses can just as easily do that as the sheep can. So you want to keep that in mind, that if you're using larger bales of hay or even small square bales of hay, the storage is important, and it needs to keep quality in mind, so that you're not losing quality by the way that we're storing this hay and creating a lot of waste, which is just going to add to your feed bill annually. So if you're feeding hay free choice to horses, which means they just have hay available to them all the time, then you're going to need to take additional factors into how much hay you're going to need, 10 to 50% more, depending on your feeding method. Covered feeders are going to reduce waste if you don't have weather damage and things like that, or feeding inside in a lean-to or run-in, those types of things. If you limit feed plus about 5 to 10%, you can reduce some of that waste. So if you figure out roughly what your horses are going to need a day by weight, and use that 2.5% body weight a day, add 5 to 10% of that, instead of just having hay out there all the time, you can reduce your waste a little bit. So typically if you use 3 to 3.5% of their body weight as fed to determine limit feeding, and then add a little bit to that, you can, again, using our example of a 1,000-pound horse, that animal is going to need to be presented with 30 to 35 pounds of hay a day to meet their total nutrient intake needs. There's a lot of debate over how we feed hay. Should hay be fed outside or inside? And outside feeding is preferred, where we're out in the fresh air, the wind's blowing, keep some of if there is dust or a little bit of the particles in the hay as it breaks down, blowing away, those kinds of things. Maybe in a run-in or something like that, but not in a stall necessarily. But you can feed hay in stalls too. And then the great debate is, do we feed horses on the ground, or do we feed them up in the air in a hay feeder? Gravity would indicate that if you feed them on the ground where their head is down, then it's harder for the dust and other particles and molds and things to get into the animal's lungs and potentially cause problems. But if we're feeding on the ground, then you have the potential risk of sand colic if they're eating directly off the ground. So using mats or tires or something that you can contain that hay in, so the animals aren't picking it up right out of the dirt, but yet have access to it all the time where their head's not up in the air, that may be the best way to go. But there is still a lot of debate. There's a lot of science and research being done on the proper way to feed horses hay, but nature would typically dictate if they're out grazing, they have their head down between their feet. So my personal opinion is that animals ought to be fed down on the ground rather than up in hay feeders, but keeping in mind the sand colic type issues and coming into play with that. You also want to keep in mind horse safety and ease of use with whatever types of feeders or ways that you're providing that, providing it down, the hay to the horses. One neat idea I saw at a farm I was at one time was that a person got some old runner type carpets that you use in entranceways to buildings that are heavy rubber carpet. When they get worn down, a lot of those companies just throw those out or try and recycle them in some way. You can get them for really inexpensively. Flip those over, rubber side up, throw the hay on top of it out there. There might still be a little dirt around, but you're going to really limit that, and it's really kind of a safe thing for the horses to be around, as long as you don't have horses that like to pick them up and drag them around the field all the time. So here's some different types of feeders, and again, these would be up in the air options. The round bale feeder, obviously the horse could get its head down, but different things that you can use to feed horses in. There's the standard stall racks. Again, horse has its head up in the air when it's eating, so you have to weigh that, but those are feeders that are available to be used in stalls or run-ins. Now, looking at hay storage, hay should be stored inside whenever possible, kept out of the weather. There's some sunlight exposure on this hay stored in this open-ended hoop building, as you can see, but it is off the ground. There's pallets down there on the bottom. You may still get some molding happening there in that bottom layer, so you'd want to check it. But at least this hay isn't in direct exposure to rain. The outer bales will get a little sun bleaching, might lose a little vitamins there, but the inner bales should still store pretty well there. The one thing I would say about this particular hay stack is it's stacked a little bit close to the roof of the building. If you look over on the left side of the picture, there's not a lot of airflow around the left-hand side of that stack, so that might be something to consider. Leave a little bit more of airspace around there to keep air flowing evenly around the bales. And try and keep hay off the ground whenever possible. Even in a cement floor barn, if you put it right on the ground in there, you will get some molding, as that cement has moisture condensing through it, especially in the winter months. So you want to make sure that you get it off the ground where you can get some airflow underneath it to help prevent mold from occurring. If you look at these two pictures here, you can see the difference between some hay that's stored completely inside versus hay that's stored in an open-sided building. Now, the hay interior to those bales is probably fine, but you're going to have more waste in the picture on the right, and that's just something to keep in mind as you handle hay that way. Inexpensive versus high quality covers. If you're storing hay outside, if you need to store some hay outside, using the cheap black plastic may sound like a good idea at the time, but you'll notice the picture on the left, there's a lot more waste with that. You're going to lose a lot more hay. There's some moisture going to get down in between those bales. Even if you're not in a freezing and thawing environment, the moisture and rainfall that gets in there is going to cause some damage to that hay, versus the picture on the right where it's well covered stacks. The only thing I would say there is the stacks are close enough together that you could get some water pooling in between those bottom bales on the bottom, and it doesn't look like those are off the ground at all, but certainly they're covered a lot better, so your waste would be significantly less there. Horiolism, just wanted to mention it briefly. We could talk a lot about different plants and things that could cause problems for horses around the state and country, and you know, every area of the country is a little bit different in what plants we're concerned with, what insects we're concerned with. But this is one, when I talk to Michigan producers, that I want them to be aware of. There's a lot of good information out there on Horiolism and what it looks like and where you can find it. There's some other weeds that look similar to it that are often confused with it, but if you look for that white flower, translucent teardrop-shaped seed pod, and we usually see it in later cuttings of hay. We don't see it much in first cutting. It's typically found in second or third cutting. But it is a short-lived perennial, or an annual in some areas, depending on how much damage was done to it when it was harvested. Generally, we see it in sandier quality soils, poorer quality soils, edges of the field that don't get maybe as fertilized as well. Those kinds of things is where this tends to show up. Overgrazed areas, if it's in a pasture situation as well. On hay fields that haven't been maintained properly or getting old, those types of things, we tend to see Horiolism creeping into those. It's mainly only a problem in high concentrations when we get 30 to 70% of the bale made up of this, but I have been working with some farms lately that have seen some of the symptoms of Horiolism toxicity, and we're only finding just a few plants here and there. It certainly wouldn't be at the 30 to 70%. We haven't been able to pinpoint any other cause, and it's certainly exhibiting some of the symptoms of Horiolism toxicity, and we have found limited quantities of it. So that would lead us to believe that potentially that is an issue that could have caused it. So science is still out on exactly how much causes the problem, but general rule of thinking is it is quite a bit. So it would be easy to spot if you're finding it in the hay, and that goes back to that looking for foreign material in the hay as you see it. But the clinical signs that we're mainly looking at is fever, colic, bloody diarrhea, laminitis, anorexia, dehydration, early parturition in mares, so you have to be really careful with it with breeding stock. Now, one of the things that we I've seen a lot of this summer more than others, and I think because some hay, especially from Michigan and the Midwest, is being shipped around other parts of the state, is there's a big concern about Horiolism. And I would say, just from my experience in working with hay producers, that Horiolism isn't a widespread problem. It's just something to be aware of, that we don't want to see it become a problem. So helping livestock and horse owners keep hay producers aware that it is an issue that they need to be monitoring for in those fields. But I don't think that there's any widespread epidemic of Horiolism in hay being shipped around the country and causing problems with horses. But because there has been discussion about it, I think the word is spread around that Michigan hay in particular, or other states in the Midwest, have this problem, and I would say that that's not necessarily true, but again, it's just something that you want to be aware of. Just like if you live in states where blister beetle is a problem, you certainly need to be aware of it, although it is often controlled in those areas because those producers are aware of the issue and do everything that they can to keep that out of the hay. Now there is a question here about fescue. And fescues can be a problem. We're looking at making sure that varieties that are out there that are being utilized for hay are the endophyte-free varieties, so that we don't have to worry about the endophyte problem causing some issues, especially in breeding stock with those pregnant mares. So you want to just keep that in mind too. If there is a lot of fescue and hay in your area, you want to make sure you're asking if it's endophyte-free variety. And with that, I think that wraps up my presentation. I'd be happy to entertain a few questions if any of you have any more. Okay, there's a lot of questions. I've gotten a lot of questions about the non-structural carbohydrates, and I'm by no means an expert on this topic, and can certainly direct you to some areas where you could get some more information about it. But one of the things that we that we have run into here in Michigan, working with horse owners and some of the folks that I work with on campus that are a lot more knowledgeable about this topic than I, have talked about this quite a bit, in that if we really look at if the diets that we're providing with horses and trying to keep horses within their target weight, that the carbohydrate content of our hay becomes a lot less of an issue. We tend to, in Michigan anyway, and probably would guess it's true in a lot of other states as well, that we tend to overfeed grain to horses that simply don't need it. If we're feeding a good quality hay to most horses that are not under heavy work, and a half an hour workout a couple times a week is hardly heavy work, and so a lot of times we're looking at the issue of horses that have been overfed grain, and so that changes their metabolism, and then you start to look at some of these carbohydrate issues. Typically, the hay content isn't as much to worry about. Certainly if it becomes an issue and you have a horse that's under that circumstance, you obviously would want to adjust the grain that you're feeding. But then also you look at ways that you can find hay. You can start to then look at the testing for the non-structural carbohydrates and some of those kinds of things. But it's one of those areas that it's gotten a lot of press. I don't think that hay's the issue. If you have a horse that really has a problem, then what you try to do is limit intake rather than trying to totally change the type of feed that you're feeding to those horses. And so we could spend more time on that, but I think that's enough about it right now. If you have questions, I'd certainly be happy to have you email them to me and we can address it further. Question here about the difference between Timothy and fescue, and it's just simply the difference is that they're two different species of grasses. In terms of quality, palatability, those types of things, there's not a lot of difference in terms of nutrient content and those types of things. Timothy has often been billed as the horse grass, and horses do like the Timothy. The problem with Timothy, if you're trying to run it in a mixed hay, is that Timothy tends to mature earlier than some of the grasses, and we can run into some palatability issues. The same would be true with fescue in that case as well, I guess. But there's not a huge difference between Timothy and fescue in terms of its growth stages or quality factors, those kinds of things. They're basically very similar in terms of nutrient content. Let's see here. A question on pellets. Grass or alfalfa pellets, and people are using them. There are a lot of pellets out there, forage-based pellets, and those are fine. A lot of times you have to worry about a couple things. One, you have to worry about the cost, because once you start pelleting and processing the feed, your cost is going to go way up, but it certainly works well as a supplement. Again, if you have some poorer quality hay, maybe some second or third year hay that's been stored and dried, you can use some pellets to beef that up. But the other problem that you have to worry about is the way that those horses eat them, just like they would grain. You eat, just because it's a forage, you have to introduce them slowly, because if they start gobbling down big mouthfuls of pellets, you can get some choke issues and things like that with them. And so that's something that you do want to take into consideration with that, is introduce them slowly, just like any change in feeding. The hay cubes are another one, and that one probably would have a little bit more of a problem with choke if the horses aren't used to eating those, but cubes can certainly be utilized as well as extending your hay without having to go to a grain and get that nutrient content up. It just depends on your horses and what their needs are and how you're going to balance that. But certainly those things are good options to get into the diet now. Let's see here. In terms of, here's another question related to hay cubes and quality and nutrition. One of the things that you should be getting if you're purchasing hay cubes or pellets, because those are a processed feed, there are labeling requirements for those, just like your bag of feed that you would buy. If you buy an oat or a sweet feed, if that's bagged, there should be nutrient analysis available with that. If not, you can send them in to be tested just like you would a regular hay bale. But you certainly need to, try and gain that information to know what the makeup of that pellet was. If it's primarily an alfalfa base, you may have way more protein than what you need, and you have to take that into consideration when you're balancing a diet for those horses. And so if the producer of those pellets doesn't give you the information, you would have to go get that yourselves. But typically, if you ask for it, they should be able to make that information available to you. Back to the issue about opening a stack of hay before it's cured and molding. Let's see here. Let me finish reading it. Why is hay? The hay when hay is baled, again, when we're baling up hay, it's typically going to have around 15% moisture. And so that moisture in the hay, and there's a chemical process when that hay dries down, and so that hay is actually undergoing fermentation. And so when we're baling the hay, you put it in a stack, there is still moisture there, and even after it sits in the barn for a year, you're still going to have moisture in that hay. It's never going to be 100% dry. And so what has to happen is the chemical process that goes into that bale into getting it to what we call cure, which is to where the chemical processes that are actually breaking down some of the protein structures and things in that hay actually average out. That process takes about 2 weeks, and once you get that hay into a stack, you want to leave it alone because you have anaerobic and aerobic bacteria that are working in there. And so what happens during that curing process is that you kill off the aerobic bacteria that are interior to that stack, and the anaerobes sort of take over and they break down all the other proteins and chemicals that they're working on. And if you disrupt that process, that's when you can get some molds. The hay wouldn't necessarily mold. It's not enough moisture to cause mold on its own. It's interrupting that process with oxygen in the middle of that fermentation process that causes the mold. It's not that the hay was too wet to put up to start with. If hay is too wet to put up to start with, you're going to get a lot of interior mold into the bales of those hay. But this is what I'm talking about would be surface mold on the hay stack that you're going to get at, because when it's in the stack, if you disrupt it, then the surfaces of those bales can mold, and you can get some waste that way as well. Next question is related to Sudan grass and cyanide containing compounds that are in there. One of the things that Sudan grass you have to be really careful with, especially under drought conditions, is that's when you get the cyanide type compounds. You can get nitrate toxicity and things as well. And so the key with Sudan grass is it has to be actively growing and over 18 inches tall when it's harvested to be safe. And so certainly Sudan grass is something that we can use, but you have to use it cautiously, especially in a drought year. And some testing might be in order to make sure that you are using that material safely. And a lot of questions need to be asked. And if it's an issue where you are looking at sourcing Sudan grass type hay, then I would get some more information on that particular topic before you went any further with it and purchased that hay. Let's see. In terms of sending in hay cubes to getting them tested, any lab in your area that does forage testing, a lot of the land-grant universities do it. Here in Michigan, we have a private lab called Litchfield Analytical Services in Hillsdale County that does a lot of forage testing for producers around the state. They can be found online. There's any place that you could send in a hay or feed sample for testing would be a good place to do that, and you can contact me and get some more information on that if you need it. Optimum protein for the average horse. Most of our horses at maintenance your geldings or your mares that aren't pregnant, that are just kind of out around, and you're doing some work with them. Typical protein content that we're looking at feeding is going to be somewhere around 9 to 10%. Growing horses, lactating horses, those types of things, horses under high work loads, those horses are going to have higher protein requirements. But most horses, 9 or 10% protein is all you really need. They can convert some extra protein to energy, but most excess protein comes out in ammonia in the urine, which can add to environmental issues if you're in the barn with those horses. And so you get more ammonia buildup in the urine if you're overfeeding protein greatly. Again, on the nitrates and grasses and drought areas, once you get a drought-stressed problem in some of those grasses, when you're going to have nitrate issues, there's really nothing that you can do to change the components of those hay grasses other than to get them growing again. And so the best thing to do is try and source hay from areas that haven't had that situation. Hay that's actively growing can mitigate that issue. Sudan grass is one in particular that we really need to watch, but it can be an issue. In drought years, we really get into a problem because things start to get harvested that may be problematic, and some different species are more sensitive than others, and so you need to really, there's no way to mitigate it. You just have to monitor for it and watch it and try and get that under control the best that you can. Let's see, back to the protein again. I think we got the how much is required and what should come from hay, what should come from grain. It can all come from hay. Even poorer quality grass type hays are going to be 9, 10, 11, maybe even up to 15% protein. And so you want to keep that in mind, that you don't necessarily need the grain for protein. We're typically feeding grains for energy. Excess energy. If the hay is lower in energy, lower in TDN content from balancing that ration, the horse is going to be energy deficient, especially in environmental extreme conditions like winters, for outside house horses, that type of thing. Then we use the grains to boost up the energy. But typically, if you have decent quality hay and you've gone through those selection criteria that we talked about, then your hay is going to meet most of the nutritional needs for your horses. In terms of, let's see here, the grass fescue or the fescue grass hay, if they're used to those types of forages and you're sure that you've got the endophyte free varieties, there shouldn't be any problem with feeding that hay to horses. Recognizing differences in grasses, that's a tougher question, because once that hay is baled, it can be very difficult to identify individual grass species, and I still struggle with that, and I study it all the time. There's some common ones. If the grass has gone to seed, which makes the palatability go down, you've got the seed head to work with. But if you're just looking at a vegetative grass, there are the USDA grazing specialists have some very good bulletins and some online resources through the United States Department of Agriculture that you can look up some forage resources. There's some good pictures and different growth stages of those plants that you can try and get different leaf structures and leaf types and things to get a general idea of what type of grass, but really pinpointing what grasses are there without seeing it actively growing, and in a lot of cases in seed stage, is very difficult to determine sometimes. I'm not sure about the question dealing with carbs and fat percentage. If you have something more, and the beet pulp one as well, if you have some more information on that, I can try and address those. But it gets us a little outside of the hay realm. The question about feeding native grasses better than orchard or fescues. Not really. I mean, it depends on what your horses are used to getting, but it's not necessarily any better. It really depends on, again, looking at having that nutrient analysis and feeding your horses what they need. There's nothing wrong with native grass pastures or hay fields, and there's nothing wrong with orchard and fescues either. Again, it gets back to really getting at the needs of the horse. In terms of feeding beet pulp, that's another fiber supplement that that you can utilize. There's a lot of data available on it in terms of the benefits and things, and it is another option. If beet pulp's available relatively inexpensively in your area, you can certainly use it as a hay replacement for a certain part of the diet. It is a good fiber source that's available. It's a good nutrient content. You just want to make sure that you balance it in the rations that you're feeding. In terms of advice for hay growers, managing and pricing, basically this year hay should pretty much sell itself. But the key is, if you're really trying to target horse owners in particular in the hay market, it's really looking at understanding the horse owner population. There are some large stables around that buy large quantities of hay, but there's also an awful lot of small stables that just need a little bit. And it's really working with people to understand what their needs are, and trying to balance that with getting a fair price and get your needs met as a hay grower, but also trying to make sure that you understand that population and that there's certain needs that they're going to request. But if you have a good quality hay, you've been selling it to horse owners, and the word gets out, the hay over time should basically sell itself, and you'll probably have a problem where you have less hay than you have customers wanting it. So be happy to talk further at another time with anybody that has questions about getting into the hay market and that kind of things if you want to. Okay, the question on the fats and carbohydrates was basically looking at feeding. If the hay is 9 to 10% protein, what's the remaining 90%? What percentage should be fat and what percentage should be carbohydrates? And actually, that question's a little bit complicated to answer. We're really looking at balancing a total ration, and there isn't necessarily a percentage of fat or a percentage of carbohydrates. That part doesn't really matter. It's balancing the energy requirement based on the needs of that horse and what workload they're in. And so what we try and do is do individual analysis for groups of horses, and I can't just give you a percentage of energy that we need, which is what the fat and carbohydrate content is going to be. It's not just as simple as doing just an energy percentage. You'd have to calculate that based on groups of horses and what their needs are.
I just wanted to thank Matt for being our expert speaker tonight, and thank you to all of you for attending tonight's web presentation. If you noticed on the slide, we do have a horse nutrition course now available through My Horse University, so if you're interested in that, please visit the website, myhorseuniversity.com. Also, we will have a web presentation in December, as well in January and February. So if you want to check those out, please go visit the website. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to email info@myhorseuniversity.com. Thank you so much.